Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Phil Wagner, founder and CEO of Sparta Science. Super excited today because I get back to, at least personally, to my roots and really my passion for starting this, which is strength and conditioning. And I was a coach in the professional and collegiate realm for about 8 years. And now the industry is facing, as we all know, a ton of uncertainty in the sports realm. One that, through all the things that this country's dealt with, 9/11, Great Depression, really have not seen anything like this. And brings up a lot of questions that we're going to cover today. When are we going to return to sports? What's the prep time before that's going to be allowed before athletes actually go into competition? And then what's the condition that we should expect, or how can we gauge that condition when these athletes do return? And how we can combat this uncertainty really with the help of technology. And grateful to be joined today by some awesome coaches, and specifically got feedback from the last couple webinars that it would be helpful if we dove a little bit deeper into how customers are using Sparta, and specifically in this time. So today, that's where we're going to focus, is that use of Sparta and systems and how they're used during times of uncertainty or chaos. And so I think it's important first to kind of let each of you on the panel introduce yourselves and briefly touch on your background before we dive into some of these topics. So if we start, Christina, I don't know if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief introduction on yourself and your background, and then I'll introduce the next panelist.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Phil. My name is Christina Rasnake, and I am assistant strength conditioning at University of Delaware. I also work with our sports analytics, so all our technology, specifically Sparta Science, processing all that information and providing it to our support staff, as well as our coaches and administrators. I work specifically with men's lacrosse, women's field hockey, and track and field and cross country.
Great. And Chris Stewart, if you wouldn't mind giving a brief intro.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the panel. I appreciate it. Yes, my name is Chris Stewart. I am the Associate Athletic Director of Strength and Conditioning at the University of Delaware. Been doing this for over 20 years now, and just like many coaches, this is brand new, uncharted waters, but we have a lot to learn during this time as well about the great ability for the body to adapt. So it's pretty exciting to be able to have this discussion. Previously, I was at the University of Richmond and then the University of Tennessee. Primarily work with football, but oversee the department. A bunch of great strength coaches. Thank you.
Great. And then next, Mike Jasperson.
Hey, everybody. My name is Mike Jasperson. I'm the Major League Physical Performance Coach for the Colorado Rockies. Previously, I had the opportunity to do an internship at the University of Denver working with Olympic sports. And now currently, I've been with the Colorado Rockies for 11 years now, and this will be my 6th year at the Major League level.
Great. Bryan Kegans.
Yeah, hi everybody. Really excited to be on here today, and I'm the director of sports science and assistant director of sports performance at the University of Oklahoma with football. Been here for 2 years now. Spent a hot second 6 months at UT in 2013, but most of my career, 11 years at the high school level. Just really excited to be here today.
Great. And Zack, I'm sure with the Z on both sides of the equation, Zack Zillner, you're used to going last.
Yeah, going last is the best. Zack Zillner, University of Texas. Just finished up my 3rd season. My main responsibility is women's basketball, and I also assist Coach Hootie with men's basketball. Before Texas, I was at University of Kansas, Illinois, and Southern Miss. I'm just happy to be here today.
Yeah, it's great to have all of you. Thank you. So we'll launch right into this this first topic. I think one of the quotes I used to hear a lot, which relates to what we're talking about, is winning conceals, losing reveals. And I think in this state we're in right now with chaos and uncertainty, it's kind of exposing systems. What is your system? Is the data you're using or used actually mean anything? How is it helping you now or previously? Does it actually drive decisions? Because we're certainly in a place right now as a society where everybody's obsessed with data and technology, and not all of it's good or useful. And so how do we really kind of leverage that more, particularly now when we're not able to constantly check in or see our athletes? I think I want to start with Mike, and excuse the informality, I'm going to call him Jasp. It just sounds weird calling him Mike, but we're going to start with Jasp here. Baseball is probably, professional baseball in my mind is probably one of the best examples of remote health or remote training. They've got, athletes at different locations in the Dominican, the minor league systems, at the major leagues, they're going up and down. And so having that continuity, whether it's through data, technology, communication, alignment, while certainly it's never gone through something like COVID, baseball certainly has had to deal with a lot of remote issues for years. And so, Jas, how have you gone about kind of creating, decision trees for how you guys operate at the Rockies?
Over the years, it's been refined. When we first started, technology to us as coaches was new. Technology to an athlete was relatively new. So there was a lot of growing pains within that system. But as far as we run our system, it's the same from the Dominican on up to the major leagues. We come in, whether it's a free agent, whether it's a guy just coming to scan during the season, it's the same. We take our guys through a warm up, we assess them, and then we sit down as a coach and a player face to face, and we have that conversation. We go over their scan, we go over their jump, and then from there, that leads us down a lot of different paths, right? We talk about physical, we talk about previous injury, we talk about their training, their previous training, and then also it can take us down personal paths as well. We see something with the scans of where we see possible fatigue or something like that, then we go through our checklists as coaches. Is there stress at home? Are we sleeping? Things like that. So that's where that tech really helps us. It gives us a very good starting point with that athlete. And then from there, we just dig a lot deeper within those conversations we have.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I learned from working with you guys is that concept of, almost a flexible framework. There's a decision tree, right? But it's also got to be flexible because there are so many pieces personally that you need to adjust for,
Right.
as you mentioned. What is that, and I've been fortunate to kind of sit in on a couple of those. What's kind of take me through that annual process you guys go through about creating your decision tree for what exercises and when? Is everybody involved? How long does it take? Is it how deep does it go? Those kinds of things. Is it pretty? I know the times that I've gotten a chance to sit in on it, very informative for me to kind of see how you guys are thinking based on your experiences as coaches.
So as a staff, we meet and we go over exercise selection as a group. So we look at, are we having trends in injury? Are we, what kind of scans are we seeing? What kind of red flags are we seeing? All the way throughout the system. And the first couple of years we did that was very humbling. There was a couple battles that we had that weren't so great, but now we love that. We love that encounter. We love talking shop. I think in doing so, we really dig deep into the movements. We are taking our bias opinions out of things. We are looking at the data and seeing what's affecting what. And that's been the biggest drive in pretty much every decision we do, from whether it's conditioning, whether it's our warm up. This takes us, our scan, and using that technology, we pretty much use that on every decision we make throughout the day. Whether a guy's fatigued, do we audible to a different movement? Do we increase intensity? Do we back off on frequency? Things like that. So I've personally enjoyed our coaches' experiences when we have those discussions. It's made us better as a staff. And I think at the end of the day, the whole goal is to do what's best for the athlete.
Yeah, sometimes it's that simple, right? You know, and it's unfortunate, but important to remind ourselves that that's what it comes down to, is that individual. You know, you mentioned the coaches and getting buy-in from the organization, and want to also bring in some others here. I know, Christina, that's been a big, initiative you've taken on with Chris at Delaware, and that really making the coaches and the other pieces of the staff aware of that information, breaking down silos. The term that I use a lot, at least, is democratizing the data. You know, sometimes in sports, like there'll be the catapult person, right? Or like the Sparta person, right? And everybody has these like little silos, right? And at the end of the day, kind of tying it back to Jasp's point, like, it's really all about the athlete, and that information should be available to everybody. So different perspectives and awareness can be made around alignment. So, I guess talk a little bit about what you've done at Delaware and how you've helped kind of break down those silos and educate others beyond just, strength and conditioning staff.
Yeah, sure. So the number one thing that we felt was important at Delaware was making sure we were using our resources wisely to help our athletes. So in order to do that, we wanted to make sure that the information that everybody was getting was speaking the same language. So if I sent a report and used a term, it's going to be the same for another sport. So we can have that dialogue across strength conditioning and athletic trainers and sports nutrition and our head coaches and assistant coaches. Everybody understands the same terminology. They understand what a fatigue scan is. They understand why a kid might be demonstrating a certain change in a variable, because we've educated them with that language. And the main reason that we've been successful with keeping that language within our entire athletic department is we are consistently testing our athletes. So we found that if we use Sparta science to the best of our ability, it's going to help our athletes holistically. So from this moment they come onto campus, we're running the baseline tests, the sway test, lower and upper. We're having them jump on the plate before they're even touching a ball or hitting a field. So we want to make sure that we get a legitimate baseline so we can use that for the athletic trainers for return to play. So that breaks down that silo by use of strength, the strength conditioning coach testing their athlete with the Sparta Science Force Plate. And then it also is going to give us more information to help our sports nutrition team make decisions for hydrating, for fueling purposes. Based on those scans, we can see if there's any movement issues on the field and have conversations with our coaches. What do you see at practice that we can work on? And does that trend with what we're seeing in our jump scan or with the balance scans? And bringing all of that together into one report is how we're able to break down the silos. So it's not just one person understanding what's going on, it's our entire department. And that's what's made us successful at Delaware.
Yeah, I love it. You used a few times in there language, right? Language is so important. Simplicity in a way of that language is so key, right? Because the more words you have, right, it's like learning a foreign language. You know, it becomes more difficult to be on the same page. You know, obviously the strength conditioning staff's not the only people the athletes are interacting with. You know, and so hearing the same message in a different way from different folks only strengthens, you know, the objectives that you guys have as a department. You know, I think the other word you used in there was baseline, and so want to also bring in Bryan here to talk about, you know, football a lot of times gets viewed, those who aren't in it, as, you know, something where everybody's the same and you're just trying to get bigger, faster, stronger. But it's actually, as we know, a very heterogeneous population. You know, you got a DB and you got an O-line, you know, and everything from, you know, injury history to ethnicity to muscle fiber type could not be more different. And, you know, a big way I know that you use the system is around identifying outliers, right? Those that are at risk, or those that, you know, what I really enjoy is those that are non-responders, right? Because it's very much like medicine in that regard. When we start thinking about decision trees, sometimes when you give people medicine, in this case exercise, they don't respond like the rest of the population would. And so how do you have systems or decision trees in place to, like, you know, address some of those outlying conditions?
We find that a lot of the guys that, you know, just like the Delaware, when the guys come in, you know, we test them immediately just to get that clearer picture of what kind of athlete that we're dealing with. And sometimes, especially here at Oklahoma, sometimes you have some really freaky people come in and their scans are off the charts with things, and you're never going to completely fix those. And so we continually attack it, and we continually talk to them about the things that they need to do. But we also try to explain to them that this scan is why you are who you are. And it's, you know, it's nothing to be worried about or be concerned about, but these are the things we need to do to keep you, you know, feeling healthy and playing right. And the majority of the time you create that buy-in because they start doing those things, they start feeling better, even though the scans are never going to be even and equal and within 15 of each other and all that. You know, they're like, Coach, this is the best I've ever felt. And so we address those things on a team level, just like Jas was talking about. You know, it drives our exercise decision-making model as for the team when we're in our team workouts, but it's a big outlier in how we program our auxiliary buckets. So everybody's kind of assigned to their different areas in their buckets. So when we're finished with the main, you know, what we're doing for the day, or coach, I come back, like, what's my extra stuff for today? They already know what they've got, and it's listed there on the sheet, and they have a bunch of different things that they can choose from, or they can come to us for those exercises that they need.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, a lot of that empowerment, right? Kind of what, you know, you want to give a boundary almost to play in, but frame it in a way where there's an autonomy and a choice, right? So the athlete is continually educated. Absolutely. I think one of the things that certainly you and Chris deal quite a bit with in football, right, is, you know, the traditions of football, right? Which, you know, I grew up playing in high school and college too, some amazing traditions. But sometimes in strength conditioning, some not so great ones when it comes to the weight room, right? And that sometimes heaping on dysfunction, right? You know, and so that's where data, I think, can be helpful, is helping educate on other ways behind just continuing to drive up, you know, squat, if that's the only focus, right? What other, you know, needs might that individual have? So, you know, kind of turn it over to Chris here, you know, with that in mind, you know, from what I've heard talking with our team and others, like, really helps. And you've really kind of taken this initiative of this feedback loop for changes within programming based on individuals and coaches. And, you know, how do you keep the, I guess, for lack of a better word, old school, right? Which there's a lot of great stuff in the old school, right? Like, you got to lift heavy, train as a team, work hard, push through mental, anguish. And then we've got technology, right? Where we don't want to be sitting rolling out our glutes all day, right? And activating our TA. Like, so how do we take these two, spectrums and create a feedback loop that tries to maximize, both ends of those?
Yeah, so you're talking to the right person. When I started, you couldn't do enough. You couldn't do enough squats. You couldn't do enough pulls. I began with Coach Stuckey back in the day at Tennessee, and it was work these guys as hard as you could, and thank God we didn't kill anybody and won a lot of games doing it. But you try to get out of that feeling that more is better. We obviously want to get them stronger, and especially at the level that we are at.
Yep.
These guys love football as much as those guys do at Oklahoma, and they dream of themselves playing in those big games and on Sunday. But there's a lot of our guys need that development, need a lot of development when they come in, and they have the motor, they have the drive. So that buy-in that Coach Kegans was talking about, that's been tremendous. What I have found is that, I'm a big Olympic guy, back squat, front squat guy, the whole bit. But when you start seeing the feedback of the testing results, and some of your veteran players, some of the ones that when we first started introducing Sparta Science a couple years ago to the team, and they started cueing in on some of the verbiage that, I can feel it on the field, coach. I can, I'm getting in my stance. I'm look better on film. Coach, my position coach is really, is seeing a difference as well. That's all I need to hear. I know we're going to get stronger. I know we're going to be more explosive. But how am I going to keep you on the field, and how are we going to help you perform better? So when they start giving you that feedback, I think that's the selling point for me. I love the idea of constant improvement for our coaches and our players. And continuous improvement is a big buzzword, a big buzz term around the football department. And, that's something that, I have to own too. And there's some things that I'm very comfortable with that in the past that I don't do so much of now. And so it's that adaptation, but it's also been utilizing our resources. The people on your staff, Coach Rasnake, the coaches within our department, sending them out, exploring ideas, learning, talking with MLB coaches, and figuring out how they're implementing it. And the thing that we've got a real comfort level with now is how we're implementing with the buckets, like Coach talked about. Identifying groups and, in a load, explode, drive category, and then using the supplemental work for that. And then as we get into this time right now where we're away from our athletes, the athletes are bought into the training concept, not just coming in and getting a workout, but they're bought into the training and developing concept. So it really has given a lot of good conversation with them, as we touch base with them, engage with them, and we're able to apply exercises. And even if they don't have any equipment at home, but finding ways to apply exercises and the buy-in that, they're asking the right questions. I feel like that they're really getting the most out of what they can where they're at this moment. And then to touch on what Raz was talking about with the communication and the buy-in and what you do with this information, we've got a unique system in place at Delaware that our athletic director what she developed. It's called our care meetings, and our care meetings involve the head coach and everybody from the sports performance department, so nutrition, psychology, strength and conditioning, athletic training, and then academics. So and they sit down once a month, and we use a lot of our results from Sparta to have those conversations. So we're constantly getting in front of the people who directly impact the athletes, and we have these conversations. So it helps us with the verbiage, speaking the same language with, and so that everybody kind of understands, so they all gain an appreciation and gain some ownership over some of the data that we're producing, the finding, so that's really what's really driven, in my eyes, what our success with using technology.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think, yeah, my background is more on the Olympic lifting side too. And yeah, I remember when I was at Cal, we would either snatch or clean in the morning and squat and pull in the afternoon every day. So, we got strong and fast, and so it's less a question of are those valuable, but how can you more use a sniper rifle, if you will, and be more specific about who gets what and when. I think the encouraging part for me listening to you guys talk is a big reason to start Sparta is the Cal situation I mentioned. I ended up getting let go because our whole staff got let go because we didn't get to a bowl game, and really thought that there was an opportunity to provide validation in the field of strength and conditioning because it is such a impactful profession. Spending more time with student athletes or players at the professional level more than any other. And so how can you develop technology and tools and data to actually show the impact that everyone on this call is having? So that's super, satisfying from a personal level. I think, you guys talk a lot about buy-in and engagement. I want to bring in Zack here because as most of you guys are aware, I think every sport has their own challenge. Distraction or engagement would be basketball, for sure. They're constantly being, noise is coming into their space. Teammates, social media, family, AAU, recruiting, scouts, all these different areas. So Zack, talk a little bit, I guess, about the role of, your systems, your decision tree, and how that helps you kind of combat or reduce some of the noise that poses these challenges in basketball.
I think with our players, especially the education piece drives change. So basketball, it's a team sport, but it's very individualistic. I feel like every kid, if you work basketball, you know what I mean? Everyone thinks that they're a special player and all that, which they obviously are to get to this level. But it's easy enough to teach them, why their scan matters for them and how it's going to take them to the next level and what tools we can do to make them feel the best, to play the best. So a lot of these basketball players don't like lifting weights. That's not really part of the culture, but you can show them
Big, right?
Do what?
You get too big, right?
Exactly. It'll screw up your jump shot.
Yeah.
That's why I can't shoot the ball around them.
Yeah.
Give them credit. So we'll show them their scan. We'll be like, hey, this is why you're in the performance group. You need to lift heavier. This is why we're doing all this Olympic lifting for you to make you, change your directions, be quicker on defense. So coach quits yelling at you. The other end is, hey, you're a point guard. You're all over the place. You're super stiff and tight. You probably don't feel that good. This is why we're going to spend more time doing recovery, mobility, all that kind of stuff. So we can show these athletes a scan and be like, all your values have dropped. What have you done the past week? And like, well, I don't sleep. I was in the gym super late shooting and got 3 hours of sleep before class. And it's like, okay. Or on the other end, like, I'm feeling really good. What things are we doing to do that? Are you sleeping right, eating right, doing your recovery? So you kind of put it in their hands of, if you want to feel good, go this route. If you want to continue to feel bad when you're on the court and whatnot, you can keep this route.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a lot of it is, kind of keying in on this education or empowerment, right, of the athlete, which is certainly a shift that's happened, I think, over the last 10 years where, the modern athlete is no longer just comfortable being told what to do. They want to know why, and that education and that data, in a way, has to be provided to them in a digestible manner, or they'll go to Dr. Google, right? Which he's the worst or she's the worst, because, there's all this information they're going to look at, and why aren't I doing X? Shouldn't we be doing Y? And so having simple information they can understand, in a way, is defensive as much as it is offensive. I actually had a discussion a couple of days ago with an NFL, performance head, and he was talking about, one of the challenges he sees, he receives athletes, and this time they've stopped thinking for themselves in a way. They haven't become self-sufficient because they don't know enough about their own bodies, their awareness. And you guys have each actually hit on that as a key part of at least Sparta, but your systems, more importantly in general, are built to educate, the athlete and get that engagement. I think the term that I've used in the past is a Sherpa. You're really there as the guide, right? They still have to climb the mountain themselves, but you're helping them navigate that difficult path. Coming back to you, how much do the players you work with actually understand what's going on, and as you receive new players, whether that's a trade or a draft, or how long does it take to actually get to the point where they actually understand what's going on? Because I think one of the value points that you do that I've seen relative to just the MLB culture is, as you mentioned, the program's the same from the Dominican, or at least the decision tree is the same from the Dominican to the majors. And that makes it easy for players coming in. You teach something, they don't have to go relearn something else at the next level or relearn why, which unfortunately is pretty common in the MLB. So how long did it take for you, or how long does it take for a player, kind of talk about that, to really understand how they move, what that means? Obviously there's battles on the way, but talk a little bit about that process.
So I think after we assess someone and we talk about their scan, one good thing over time that we've seen is we have seen tendencies from certain positions, right? If I have a catcher come in, 9 times out of 10, we're going to have that same scan for a catcher. So it's very easy when these catchers come in to lift together that most of them are doing the exact same training. The only example, I guess, if one of those catchers wasn't doing anything, if there was a pre-existing injury, to put him in a different class per se. But over time, that's where we see great value. We see tendencies in middle infielders. We see tendencies with certain types of pitchers, whether they're 6'4" or a certain type of delivery. So I think when we relate the skill itself with the scan, guys have a tendency to understand that a lot more. And going along with that, along with Christina and communication, that's one thing that we've added is after we scan our athletes, we sit down with the sport coaches and we speak about their scan and what we are doing in the weight room. And it just so happens to turn out that most of the time, that's the exact same thing they are doing on the mound in their bullpens. That's the exact same thing that they're having troubles with these athletes hitting. So I think with the sport coaches, along with us communicating the same thing, it honestly doesn't take very long. It doesn't take very long at all.
Yeah, movement is, what you're saying, right, is that movement is reflected, or the movement pattern, right? If a guy, we certainly have talked about guys that have trouble getting into a deep squat, right? Usually because of limited dorsiflexion. And then the pitching coach is trying to help them work on loading more with that back leg in order to drive out to throw a pitch, right?
Getting into your legs, not drifting towards the plate. Those are the things that we talk about. And along the lines of communication with coaches, we've actually had to learn their language.
Love it.
Right? We've at first we tried to take our language and communicate with them, and now we've learned their language and we've kind of molded that together to make it a lot easier.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and so the other thing you mentioned there is a different class. So probably not even aware of it now because your decision tree is so, in a good way, invisible. Catchers go down a certain way generally because they have a certain movement pattern, but there's a decision tree branch in there if there's a previous injury. For example, they could be a Tommy John surgery in the past, that happened with that same catcher. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but then therefore that same individual, even if they have the same, Sparta signature on the force plate, they'll be treated differently based on that injury history.
Correct. I mean, obviously we don't want to re-injure that athlete. We have to treat him a little bit different, but that's where the scan and taking in other aspects and putting everything together comes into play.
Yeah. And the largest risk for an injury is a previous one. So that's, when we think about including other variables, that's got to be pretty close to the top. I think for most looking at building out their own system and decision tree is like, what's the history of this individual in terms of injury? So kind of opening up here, systems, decision trees, ideally, I think a lot of times make decisions easier. So coaches have more time to spend educating and talking and getting to know the athlete, because a lot of times they may, for example, if we use that previous injury, they may use that time to reveal an injury they didn't reveal before. Not because they're trying to hide anything, but just because, when they're filling out those forms, they may not be reflecting very much and just rushing through it. Or what they thought was kind of a little bit of a knot was actually something bigger. So kind of open up the floor here, any thoughts on, key tactics you guys might use that we haven't covered about how to better empower the athlete with this data, and really how to educate them to take ownership, right, of the process and the information that you're providing them.
I think to start, I think the first thing that I've seen from the team has been the competition. So they all look for a number. You can put any number on that screen that you want to put, but if my number is higher, I'm better, right?
Right.
So so when we are testing or evaluating, then they get into that. So then that makes them really start to pay attention, and then I try to follow up with them. With this is what we were last time. This is how we changed. See how what exercises you're doing is helping you, improving your movement, and therefore your scores improving. And they have a hard time understanding why it's not always best for one number to be through the roof, and then to have an outlier like that. But then the other thing is when they get, like, when we put them into these groups, and they're doing the supplemental part of the workout. So if they're doing some of the supplements, then I may have an offensive lineman doing the same thing that I have a little receiver doing, or vice versa. So it gets them to interact differently with guys, or maybe different sides of the ball. So they're working with and training with guys that they typically wouldn't. And I think that helps build the team culture. And then it also, it's kind of cool to see how they interact, and how, sometimes you've got leaders leading people that you didn't even think these guys could lead. You didn't see that. You haven't seen that out of them before. So I think it creates a different environment. So because in our structure, the way we train based in groups, based off of academic schedule, not based off of team positions and things. So. Yeah. I think one of the things that another theme I'm kind of picking up here from you guys, which is a value of data, is it allows cross disciplines to learn from each other. Whether that's as you mentioned, Chris, the offensive line and defensive back, in a group together because they might need the same thing. Jas, you mentioned kind of the language of learning, across your discipline of learning pitching language from those coaches. And Bryan, you even mentioned, like, with the MLB, like, obviously your work with Oklahoma football, is a very different environment than the MLB, but if there actually is a shared data and variables, like, there can be an opportunity to learn tactics and movement patterns from each other. I think that in a way is a lot of danger
behind technology now is the information sometimes, or the data may not be reliable or consistent. We see that sometimes with other data sets. And so therefore, what you guys are seeing makes it incomparable to talk to each other in different environments. You can't really learn from each other. And also, I think, and we've seen this, Jas, too, not with Sparta, just with other things, it also erodes trust from the athlete, or erodes trust from the front office or the coaches if the data you're collecting is randomly fluctuating in a big way, right? Because then the question becomes, hey, well, can I even trust this? So I think it's really making sure that reliability or the consistency of data is such a bedrock, I think, for building up the trust of the individual athlete, but building in the trust amongst each other, amongst our profession. That's a big part of medicine, is when you talk about, we take a basic example like blood pressure. If I talk to another doc about 110/80, or any of you guys or my kids, they're all going to understand what 110/80 means. And as a profession, as we can slowly get to that place, I think it bodes well for our standing and our validation as a community, that the data and the information be trusted to make decisions. I know we've got a lot of questions coming in too, which is great. People submitting questions. So I don't know, Buck, if you want to ask that question, that one of the questions that just came in.
Yeah, sure. And so one of them, and Jas, you talked about your decision trees and what you guys do with your athletes. Does that change at all post-COVID? Or do you have to change anything that you would normally do now after guys come back? Or do you kind of stick with the same plan that you have and the same decision trees you already have in place?
I think as of right now, we're treating it as our off season. We have a good blueprint of all our athletes because we have so many scans of guys. It comes down to a few things. We're fortunate enough to where guys have the means to have a gym at their house, right? So physically, I don't think we're going to go backwards a lot. But then we have on the major league guys. But then on the other end of the spectrum, these younger guys, we're giving them body weight programs, things like that. These guys we're a little concerned about, but we're going to assess. And from a physical standpoint, we'll have a good idea of where they're at. I think the biggest thing that we need to do is get with skill coaches. It's not going to be like a traditional spring training to where we show up and we roll it out like a traditional spring training. We have to mesh what they're doing physically with sport activity as well. So I think moving forward from our department, not much will change, but actually us communicating with sport coaches on how much on-field activity they would do, or how we build that out, depending on how much time they give us.
Yeah, that'll be key for probably everybody on this call, right? Is like, what's going to be that window, that whether it's the NCAA or the MLB, right? What's going to be that window between, campuses reopening, teams reopening, and competition starting, right? That's going to be a big decision. And I think key to what everybody's talked about is communication, because that's going to have to be tight between not only medical, but the sport coaches as well.
We have an interesting situation here, is that some old school coach like Barry Switzer lives across the street from the stadium. So we see him all the time. And our head athletic trainer was around during those days. And he constantly reminds us, and we talk about the idea that, players used to show up for camp, play football, and then leave, and they were gone all summer and they showed up and, yep. They did it back then. And I mean, we can do it again. And it's kind of the theme is we constantly talk about, we don't need to freak out and all this kind of stuff. We just got to be smart about how we approach everything. We have the data, we have the numbers, and we know where we need to get to. Yeah. We just got to make sure that we're communicating that across the board and getting our guys there safely.
Yeah, and to that point, right, Bryan, it's keeping everybody calm, right? Like, yes, while COVID is unprecedented, some of the situation that's presented is not so much, and so really that communication and using data and information can help kind of ease everybody's concern, because I'm sure nobody on this call has sport coaches that are overly anxious and micromanaging, right? Because everybody's totally cool with what's going on, right? So but I think having the information and the trends can help ease any concerns that exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to
I think
play
another
off
one.
that,
Go ahead, Christina.
to play off that with the amount of scans that we've performed at Delaware, when we do have the kids come back and we do the baselines like I talked about earlier, it's really going to help us have that hard conversation with the coaches to slow them down when they first get on campus. We're not going to be aware of whether the student athletes have built up enough chronic load, especially our fall sports. Normally their preseason is 4 to 5 days before they have a scrimmage. So technically our coaches are used to a shorter preseason on the Olympic side. On the football side, it's a little different. They have a very strategically set up preseason. So for our Olympic coaches, I'm hoping they're not going to panic as much. But I have a feeling that because they lost their spring ball season, whether it's soccer or field hockey, they're going to feel that they have to make up on the tactical and the endurance side of the sport. But I feel that if we use our data that we've collected in the past, that we've collected consistently, and we use that with other technology, whether it's heart rate monitors or it's GPS, and we were last year and say, we need at least a minimum dosage. You've been talking about exercise as medicine. What's the minimum dosage we need and a quality amount of time? So not quantity, so we don't need a 2-hour practice per se. What is the exact dosage in that little bit amount of time that we're gonna have to get our athletes in a safe place to perform at the level that we need them to? Yet again, not where we want them to be, but where we need them to be so they are safe and still able to compete without feeling a ton of limitations.
Yeah, there's going to be kind of 2 phases, right, Christina? There's going to be like show up on campus, scan folks, assess them. Then they're going to get loaded up with their sport. And then what happens then, right? How do they adapt? And I think in the past, as a community, we've had to make assumptions of like, you know, oh, well, they'll need 10 days to adapt or 5 days or 21 days. But the reality is, right, everybody's going to be all over the map on how they adapt. You know, there's so much individual variability. Some people may show up great and be relatively unaffected by the loading that's placed on them, whereas others, you know, are going to really drastically change after those first few days back in their sport.
I would chime in too here. You know, how do you get the sport coaches to buy into the data you're collecting in the weight room? And Christina, you might be able to elaborate on this. You talk about, you and Chris have both talked about these care meetings, and maybe it's easy, you know, if you're in that care meeting for them to understand it on a deeper level. But if you don't have those meetings, how can you get the sport coaches to understand kind of the data that you're talking about?
I feel that, you know, I make, for all our varsity teams, I make reports on the Sparta scans. And based on those Sparta scans, I provide information for them to present at the care meeting. So we're talking about the athletic trainers, performance nutrition, and strength conditioning. Specifically with our head coaches, I like to try and present it kind of what Mike was saying earlier in their language. So if I have a rotational sport, I want to keep the conversation on what's going to make them the best in their specific position in their specific sport. So to communicate the changes, to communicate the trends, I think our best way of winning the coaches' buy-in and interest in this technology is to state it in the terminology that they're going to understand the most. And let's be honest, the language they want to hear is winning. And that comes down to performance. And if I can apply it in that way, you know, that's a positive road that I can go on, especially with a new coach or even an old coach that is very much against technology. I over by explaining and showing them the information that we're collecting, not just the raw data. They're not going to want to look at that. They're going to want to understand in how it's going to help them.
Yeah, it's got to be provided in context, right? What's the context with, because, back to Chris's point, like with the competitiveness, people tend to be, at least the stakeholders, the real stakeholders, which is the athlete and a lot of times a sport coach, they tend to be less concerned with the raw data, and they want to know, am I better than before, right? And the other thing they want to know is, am I better than my teammate, right? And so like contextually, they want to know, how do I compare against all the other football players, at this level or this age or this conference, because it's all about ranking for them in some way. There's always some sort of internal ranking engine that's going on with them, at every level, every gender, every sport. I think, wanted to circle back on that too, in some of those discussions. Another term that came up, and I think Jas, you mentioned this, was audibles. A lot of things do come up, and how are you able to audible? You actually formally plan in audibles, just like an offense in football. Players got, okay, here's where we're going to run, but if we see this defense, right, we're actually changing the play to this. And so you guys as a staff have actually set up, that type of an offense where things happen, you're able to audible, and everybody on the staff has the same audible in mind. Is that
right? We have some unique challenges in Denver. We deal with altitude. We're the only team in our time zone. So whenever we travel, we switch time zones. So that has some issues with it. So in our programming, if we have a day game to travel across the country, guys probably can get some sleep. If we get rained out and then all of a sudden we have a double header the next day, we have to make those audibles. We have to make those changes for those guys. We don't just make them train just to train. So we have built in your
system, right? The audible is actually part of a decision.
Yes.
It's not like,
it's not like
you're rolling dice. Yeah.
No. So essentially we give them ownership of that. We build in choices for those guys to choose. If I'm feeling fresh, I'm going to do this. If I feel fatigued or a little banged up, I'm going to move down this path. But in a sense, we are still sticking with those same movement patterns, and we are getting what we want, and the athlete's getting his work in and has that sense of ownership of his own program.
Yeah. It's that win-win, right? You want that choice to happen to get full buy-in, but scientifically or physiologically, you want to make sure that it's in the same kind of bucket or family of things.
Correct.
Are you guys doing that stuff, audibles right now too, for your guys that you obviously can't see right now? Can you give an example of like an audible of what you would do, or how a player understands an audible?
So I'll give you an example of a certain lift, elevated split squat. As all of you guys know, those aren't very fun. It's a little taxing. We have built in an audible to do a reverse lunge, front-loaded reverse lunge. We used to audible down to a hip thrust, a one-leg hip thrust, but we have found over time that guys that don't really like to train will audible straight to that one leg hip thrust and do minimal weight, maybe 25 pounds. So we started to see, I don't want to see lazy trends, but we still want that culture of guys to come in and work. And so we switched to that reverse lunge to possibly get the same effect.
That's a good point. I think the athletes understand, though, it's still a reason that they're doing that audible. It's not just to continue to work out. It's why was that in there, and why was it an audible for that specific exercise, and what was the intent of that? And so I think, now that you've been using, the system for long enough, the guys understand that. And I think the education along the way is a big reason why they understand that and keep doing it. And audible, there's intent for everything they do, which I think is important. You know, and Zillner mentioned it, you know, the education along the way. Why do we do what we do? What do we do when things go wrong? How can we improve it and get back? And what's the intent of everything? And so I don't know if you have anything you want to elaborate as far as Audible, Zack, or what you guys have been doing or what you did previously. But I think, you know, especially during this time, it's important to know like why, you know, why should we do certain things that we're doing when we don't have access to what we normally have access to, and how can we make the best of it? You guys doing some remote stuff right now?
Yeah, I mean, in season, what we would do is, you know, if a player unexpectedly had to take, you know, way more reps in practice, let's say the number one guy, you know, got taken out of practice and the number two person way more reps than they would, the next day they're obviously going to feel a little bit different than if they did their usual, you know, a third of the amount of reps. So we might cut down the volume in the weight room, or take down the weight, just depending on what they would need. They would still pretty much do the same movements, but we might add a few auxiliary stuff. So like their hips or low back's going to be tight, so maybe we'll add a few more of those paired up with, you know, their big movement for the day. And then a lot of the guys, while they're home, you know, it's honestly really good for basketball players because we train probably 48 or 49 out of the weeks out of the whole year. So they're in the weight room a ton. So it's honestly good to get them away from that kind of stuff and get them better at, you know, the stuff they don't necessarily like doing, like the mobility, kind of calisthenics type work. The guys that need the performance and the stiffness, you can actually, you know, run, sprint, jump, all that fun stuff at home. So it hasn't been that big of a deal. We've just been communicating with them as far as how you feeling, how's your body feeling, and then we'll make some changes from there.
Have you guys built in any recovery interventions for when you see specific variables dip or go down?
Yeah, so we're actually going to get this in a few weeks. We're getting an infrared sauna, which is going to be into our recovery protocols for these guys. But right now it's kind of working with athletic training as far as, you know, do we need cold tub, hot tub, if they need more manual type recovery. A lot of our stuff is lower leg and foot. So a lot of the guys, if their knees are bothering them, it's usually foot related, ankle related. So we use a ton of modalities there with like the vibrating plates and different things like that. So that's kind of our prescription. Guys kind of know like, hey, my knees aren't feeling so hot, I need to go to weights, you know, 10 minutes earlier, come after practice for 10 minutes and work on my foot, lower leg, complex stuff.
And I would also ask the same for Coach Kegans too. I mean, you guys come in, and I've seen it, you know, come in, you know, pretty beat after a weekend. I mean, this didn't happen often with you guys, but when they were beat up, how often would you switch something based on someone's subjective, I'm really beat up versus, you know, what you're seeing in the force variables, et cetera? Would you guys switch up and have an audible plan?
Absolutely. So we each have our groups amongst the five of us. You know, we have our groups of the guys that we see, you know, every day that they come in the weight room. Those are our guys. So we get to know them on a really close basis. And our head strength coach, Coach Wiley, allows us to make those audibles ourselves. So a lot of times the way I look at it, if a guy is beat up, he's talking, he needs that audible, that exercise change. Those things are going to happen, and I'm able to make that call as a coach with my group, as with the rest of our staff. And then as me, as the guy looking at the holistic side of the jump scans and then doing the programming, if it's a scan deal or a fatigue deal on the scan, then I got to start asking the questions when I'm starting to look at whatever cycle we may be into or what the programming has said. You know, is this because of us in the weight room doing this, or is this because of practice, and where's this fatigue coming from? Because if it's a week that I want them to recover, or if it's a performance week, when I'm saying like a dynamic week, and those numbers are red and they're down, I start looking and saying, well, they're supposed to be feeling good this week, and I don't know why. So is that on me as the guy programming the exercises, or is there something else going on? So there's different levels of decisions that got to be made when we change those. Is it just a one-on-one deal? Is the guy tired? Is he fatigued? Where's that coming from? Or is this more of a team? Is this our fault, or is it the sport's fault? Is kind of a lot of different things that we look at.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour, so wanted to, thank everybody. Huge insights, and I think some great common themes. Some of the things I picked up on are, language, empowerment, educating, the cross-disciplinary, and then ultimately whether it's, as Bryan just mentioned, recovery tactics or Jas talking about with audibles and training, and really using data to really truly drive those decisions out of its simplicity. So thank you, everybody. Thanks again. You guys are great. And stay safe.